Right, maybe to kick it off, let me just say welcome to everybody and welcome to our webinar today on food insecurity due to crisis. My name is Jessie Doppler and I am the coordinator of JPI HDHL, which is a rather long acronym and it stands for Joint Programming Initiative, A Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life. Just to start off, let's start with a few housekeeping matters. This session will be recorded so that you can access the recording afterwards as well. Mics and videos have been switched off and we kindly ask you to keep them off as well, as we're too many, of course, to have our mics and videos on. And we will first follow the presentations by our guest speakers and then followed by a panel discussion. I would also kindly ask you to use the question box at the bottom of the screen instead of the chat box. And if you have any questions as the presentations are underway, please feel free to just write them in the question box and we will be reading them out later during the panel discussion. So I would also ask the speakers not to respond in the question box because I think it's nice, of course, when we read them out and we can actually have the discussion all together. I'd like to also take the opportunity to quickly thank our chair, who is also present here today. That's Beatrice Morio, and as well my colleagues Bernadette and Larissa for all the technical support that they are offering us. Many of you are probably already familiar with who we are at JPI HDHL. As explained, it's a very long acronym and it stands for Joint Programming Initiative, A Healthy Diet for a Healthy Life. And joint programming is a public-public partnership and refers to the cooperation between member states. And currently, we have 15 countries that are involved in JPI HDHL. So we are a member state-driven initiative, and we focus on the societal challenges related to food, nutrition, and health. And whilst we mainly have European countries that belong to our initiative, we also include Canada and Israel as part of our management board. And our governing structure also includes, well, as I mentioned, the management board with funders and various ministries, but we also have a scientific advisory board and a stakeholder advisory board. And for the last 10 years, we have been an EU-funded joint programming initiative, but we are now in the third year as an independent self-sustaining initiative. And we have established ourselves as a valuable interdisciplinary research and innovation hub that connects scientists and policymakers in the fields of nutrition, health, food, and sustainability. We currently coordinate, align, promote, but also lead with our scientific research agenda in the areas of nutrition, food, health, and physical activity. So that's a little bit of a background of what JPI HDHL is and what we do. I hope it was easy enough to follow. And at this point, I would really like to hand over to Carsten, who is a professor at Technical University of Munich. And he is also a member of our scientific advisory board. I think it's nicer, Carsten, if you could present a little bit about yourself. I think that's the easiest thing to do.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jessica, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome all of you today to be the host of today's webinar. My name is Carsten Köhler. I'm a professor of exercise, nutrition, and health. So our research is really dedicated towards the integration of physical activity, exercise, and nutrition in order to impact both health as well as, or to maximize human health and physical performance. So we actually work on the broad range from elite athletes and Olympic athletes all the way down to couch potatoes, which is an interesting approach, but we really enjoy it. So maybe as a background, I am a member of the scientific advisory board of JPI HDHL. And during our last in-person, or my first, but also our last meeting I believe in September in Brussels, joint meeting between the scientific advisory board, we had talked about emerging and important questions, and we really identified food crises, or specifically response to crisis, as a very timely topic for a webinar, because I think if we had all looked back maybe 5 years or so. The experts may have foreseen some of these things that are rapidly changing, but I think at least the broader public and me not being an expert necessarily in food security, I think we've all made our own, even personal experiences, for example, during the COVID crisis, but also in response to climate change, but also in response to, of course, the Russian war, and then the resulting energy crisis. So we are at a time point, I think, in our life where many things are rapidly changing and in a crisis mode. And so this was identified as a really interesting, like I said, timely topic for today's webinar. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce the first speaker today, who is Professor Corinna Hawkes. She is director of the Center for Food Policy at the University of London. She has worked for over 20 years with agencies in the United Nations, as well as governments, universities, and NGOs, basically at any level you can think, from city to international level, to support the design of more effective policies and actions to advance healthy diets for everyone. She's also a co-investigator of the Obesity Policy Research Unit, was a member of the Lancet Commission on Obesity. She's a distinguished fellow at the George Institute for Global Health and chair of the board of Bite Back 2030, which is a movement for young people to fight for better food systems, which is co-founded by Jamie Oliver. And as a very, good news, I would like to also congratulate her for accepting her new role as the director of the Division of Food Systems and Food Safety with the FAO, which, if I'm informed correctly, she will start at the end of next month. So without any further ado, Corinna, we very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here to present on this topic, framed very much in the work that we've been doing here in the last years at the Centre for Food Policy, drawing on people's lived experience of food. As you just mentioned, I'm about to move on to a different role with the FAO. So the work that I'm presenting really is the culmination of some years of work put through the lens of crisis, and it only seems to become more relevant in these unfortunate crisis times that we live in. So I'm just going to share my screen and just want to check that that's all clear, and I'm just going to put that onto the right mode. Okay, sorry, I'm struggling to move the thing at the bottom of the screen, which is stopping me from doing what I normally do in getting it to show. Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. Can you all see my slides okay now?
Perfectly, thank you.
Right, thank you. So, as I indicated, the work that I'm going to present is the result of a lot of thinking that we've been done at the Centre for Food Policy with our lived experience research group. So I'd like to acknowledge the role of my colleagues. That work has really been looking at dietary inequalities, and as I said, is very interlinked with food insecurity and becomes even more important in these times of crisis. These are the key messages that I'd like to convey today. The food insecurity crisis is both caused and further amplified by an inequitable food system. That the increased household food insecurity we see is likely to lead to a greater inequalities in the qualities of people's diets. That understanding people's lived experience of food crisis is necessary in order to be able to identify what policies and actions will have the most impact in addressing dietary inequalities. And considering the full picture of people's realities can be used to identify what will work and how, and to assess how well current approaches are working. So firstly then, on the inequitable food system. Our food system is regrettably incredibly unequal. And in a paper published with colleagues in the Lancet over the summer, set out some of these intersecting inequities, including economic inequality, crop inequality, intergenerational inequality, gender inequality, health inequality. There's also racial inequality and resource inequality, all kinds of a longer list of inequalities. And these fundamentally come from the way that the food system is currently designed and structured, with an economic inequality really at the core of it, which, for example, means that food systems workers don't benefit from the value that is generated from the food system. There is an excessive reliance on a narrow amount of crop species. And while that seems very agriculturally related, from seeing that you can also begin to tease out why it is that these inequalities lead to a lack of resilience in the food system. Because it means that those people who disproportionately don't benefit from the value created by the food system are less resilient than those that do. And that because of the economic inequality that lies at the heart of the system, that means it makes economic sense to rely on a narrow amount of crop species. That means that the system as a whole becomes less resilient because we're not relying on so much biodiversity. And the same applies for gender inequality, for example, that women tend to have the responsibility of providing food at home, but they are less resilient in situations of crisis because they tend to be the first ones also to reduce their food intake in order to support that of their families, which automatically makes them less resilient at solving the problems at hand. So what we see then are these combination of these multiple inequities in food systems, leading to reduced resilience of the people, processes and practices in food systems, which makes the food system more vulnerable to shocks. So that means that when crisis hits, you're more likely to lead to household food insecurity because of all of these actors who are more vulnerable and less resilient that I've just listed, are then more exposed to food insecurity, which I'll then show is then linked with poorer quality diets. So crisis is a cause of this problem and a consequence of this problem, but the ultimate cause is inequity and inadequate resilience in the food system. And food insecurity that is created as a result of these crises and is a crisis in and of itself creates risks for dietary quality. The evidence is very clear what happens when households, and this is global evidence from all kinds of countries, what happens when households attempt to cope with food insecurity. It leads to meal skipping, which of course is poor for dietary quality. It involves reducing the sizes of the portions served at nutritious meals. It means preparing foods with fewer nutritious foods. It means relying on cheaper starchy staples. So for some people in some parts of the world, that could be cassava or white rice. In Europe, that's much more likely to be pasta, rice, potatoes, pre-sliced bread, very basic white bread, and also increasing intake of ultra-processed foods and snacks, in part to replace nutritious meals. So that is well evidenced that food insecurity creates risks for dietary quality in that way. So what happens then to families who are already experiencing dietary and health inequalities, who are already experiencing economic inequalities? What happens and household food insecurity when crisis hits? And what am I talking about in the current crisis? In order not to spend too much time going over all of the background, you'll notice I'm not giving a lot of background on food insecurity. I'm not giving a lot of background on the nature of the crisis in order to focus on my key messages. But just to emphasize that what I'm talking about when I'm talking about crisis is that the crisis in the food system brought about by the Ukraine situation, the Ukraine war, and COVID and all of those things. But that is playing out in rising food prices. So it is a crisis of food prices combined with the energy crisis and the price of energy and so on. So just imagine that you're in a situation of financial insecurity going into that crisis. So this is the lived realities part. Your lived reality is that you are financially insecure. You have a low income, variable and unpredictable, and you have a lot of other demands of that income, such as energy, housing, and debt payments. You live in a space that lacks space and equipment to prepare meals, often no specified place to eat, and you have inadequate transport. This is a scenario, but it's one, again, which is well evidenced. You have a job with little control, little autonomy in that job, long hours. You have an incredible amount of food work to do, particularly if you're a woman, because food work is so gendered, and you have to experience the time and stress burden of that food work, which means that you have to spend a lot of time preparing food and procuring the cheapest versions of that food. So your time burden goes up when you're low income, because the amount of time that you have to spend trying to find the cheapest and most budget efficient way of finding foods. And we know that low income families tend to have a very high level of skill in managing budgets and managing how to find the cheapest versions of foods. So in the context of financial insecurity, which has been increased in these times of crisis, it becomes logical to buy foods which can be afforded with that little limited income, which won't be wasted, which can be stored and prepared using less energy, less fuel, because that's expensive, with fewer kitchen assets, work and headspace, because you have less time. So that means that it makes a lot of sense to have long shelf life foods, convenience foods, freezer foods, snack foods, pre-prepared foods, and so on. And so you go out with those needs into your food environment. And for the most part, there are those low price convenient foods are accessible. In some parts, it can be very difficult to access them, but for the most part, those foods are available in European food environments, and as are food banks to help with people in times of crisis. But that food, some of it is healthy, and some of it, frankly, is really, really not healthy. And there is a tendency for it, even though some of those foods are healthy, to not be healthy. And so that means that the foods that you are seeking, that are value for money, long shelf life foods, convenience, freezer foods, snack foods, that's what you're seeking. You're not seeking unhealthy foods, but the foods that fit that categorization are unhealthy out there, tend to be unhealthy. But some of them are not. Some of them are just kind of pasta, tins of beans, other things that are still affordable for you. But there's a mix there with the tendency towards the unhealthy. Now, prices suddenly go up in times of crisis. Prices suddenly go up. So the prices of basics rise. So that means that all of the stresses of managing financial food security, poor household resources, labor and time suddenly goes up. That the basics that you relied on, both healthy and unhealthy, the price have gone up. So that immediately makes life extremely difficult for you in terms of how to manage your budgets. You were only just managing before. And then you go into food environments and price promotions and discounts are deeper on the less healthy foods. And that foods that you really like and that are healthy, such as berries, for example, tropical fruit, these kinds of things which are well liked by your kids, by your family, are even pricier than before. So you're in a much, much worse food insecurity situation. But you've also pushed towards those less healthy foods and more starch-based foods even more than before. And trust is another reality that plays into that. You're going to then start to trust retailers that are selling lower priced foods, that are also retailers that are full of unhealthy foods. And if you're in a situation of household food insecurity and you face these additional constraints, and you've got kids, they're even less likely to be exposed to healthy foods, less likely to develop a palate for those healthy foods. And therefore, in the longer term, the vicious cycle of inequality in diet continues because you don't learn those preferences. So, and then that becomes embedded in deeper meanings around food, which are incredibly important, the kind of cultural matters of identity and culture, where your identity becomes bound up, particularly if you're a mother or a caregiver, with making sure your kids have got enough to eat. And that means that filling the belly is more important than the dietary quality of that food, and other elements paying as well. So despite people's general knowledge of a healthy diet, in situations of crisis, It's actually rational and logical to eat an unhealthy diet, as well as for emotional and other reasons as well. So I just wanted to quickly skim by, and I can't actually see anybody on screen. So if I am going on for too long, please do tell me that whether I need to, how many more minutes I have left. So what needs to happen then to address this crisis? Well, you need to fix all of these pictures of the jigsaw. You need to make sure that people are financially secure, that people trust healthy food, that people find meaning and identity in healthy food, all of these things. And then you also need to address the systemic realities that underpin them. And that is a very, very large ask. So the good news is that there's lots of things that can be done. And if you're out there thinking, you know, what can stakeholder X, Y, and Z doing? Everybody can take responsibility to address some of these realities and to address some of those systemic inequities that underpin them. But it's a huge ask. It's a huge ask. And it's easy for me to sit in an ivory tower and saying, well, this is what people should be doing. So how to make addressing this this kind of dual problem of worsening household food insecurity and how that relates to dietary and health inequalities and all of these other systemic inequities, how can you actually get it done? The way to get it done, and the starting point, is to consider the full picture of people's realities in the design of existing interventions, looking at what is already going on that can be more fully leveraged to address people in the face of crisis. Let me give you the example of a school breakfast club. A school breakfast club program. These are in place in some countries, they're not in others, they're not part of the kind of policy culture in some countries, but for the sake of example, give you this example of a school breakfast club which is laid on to help children eat a healthy breakfast. We know that breakfast skipping is particularly prevalent among children from low-income families. The data is there to show that. So you think, okay, how can I design this school breakfast club so it's really going to help that family in crisis? Let's look at the first reality, consider the first reality that these families are living in a situation of financial insecurity. So if it's a fee program, it's more likely to work with those families. It's also going to work for those families because it is a program that reduces the demands on preparing and eating food at home. Also, if it's during the holidays. So that's thinking, how can we extend this program to make sure it's also during the holidays so it can help families in those contexts too. It's also going to help families because it removes the time, labour and stress of serving meals and also provides a form of childcare, particularly for caregivers, mainly women, who are struggling to juggle all of those balls of food work and food work outside and work outside the home. Now let's look at the reality of access. It means that if it's going to work well as a program for dietary quality as well as food insecurity, it needs to provide a selection of healthy foods. But it needs to also consider liking, to skip down to liking. That if kids really don't like the food that's served, they're not going to eat it. They're just not going to eat it. And that might be more likely from kids from lower income backgrounds who haven't been exposed to these healthy foods at home for the reasons I've just set out. So it's a brilliant opportunity for kids to learn how to taste new foods, but it might need some what's called taste education, sensory food education, which helps provide extra support for those children who haven't been exposed to those foods before. The design of the program also needs to consider the pervasive temptation and enticement of unhealthy food that might be available near the school gates, which is extremely prevalent in lots of places. It could be undermined by kids, particularly if they're older kids, buying food because spending very little money, unhealthy food on their way to the breakfast club, or kids pestering their parents because of all of these prompts everywhere to buy the unhealthy food on the way in. So that also needs to be considered in the design, as does trust. Free programs can be stigmatizing for families if they're not well designed and they don't have community buy-in. There's the opportunity there to think about the way that social relationships matters around food. There's an opportunity for social interaction at a breakfast club and peer support where you're observing other people eat healthy breakfast. That can also help everybody eat well, but only really if it's in an appealing, warm social space. It's not going to work if that isn't in place. So what I'm arguing here is that you can take these existing interventions, for times of crisis and start to think, how can I design them in better, taking the full picture of people's realities into account? And in so doing, start to address some of those systemic inequities in the food system. For example, a school breakfast intervention or a school meal intervention does help address some of the gender inequalities. It doesn't address the actual root cause of gender norms, but it does begin to address them because it takes some of the labour and time away from women. It also begins to address some of the inequalities in access and some of the inequalities in financial, the straightforward financial inequalities as well. So it's not enough, but it does begin to open a door to do some of that. So I will end there. And this is still a work that we're developing at the Centre for Food Policy as a new lens of trying to think about how to address dietary inequalities in the context of crisis and food insecurity. So we would welcome any feedback. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Corinna, for this excellent presentation. And I'm impressed that you managed to give a presentation with 8 slides. I usually have way too many, so this is, on a personal note, really impressive. There is a question in the chat. I'm going to ask this right away from Fabio Gonzalez. Apologies if I mispronounced. Thank you for your presentation. In your experience, does income inequality and financial insecurity also affect the exposure to unhealthy food marketing and unhealthy food retail? And if so, how can we act to reduce these inequalities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. I didn't dwell very much on the marketing side of things in what I just was talking about, but prompts as prompts and promotions is very much part of people's everyday reality out there in food environments. And there is data indeed to suggest quantitative data to suggest that there is uneven exposure and low-income groups are disproportionately exposed to this kind of marketing. And in the lived experience work that we do, which is not quantitative, is not representative, but it provides insights on the basis of high quality, rigorous qualitative analysis, that what happens in a lot of low-income families where there's not resources in those families to treat kids and to go out there and spend money on going out to expensive leisure activities and to take lots of travel and trips, and all cost money. So one of the things that you can do is to show love to your kids by giving them the foods that they're asking for. Which are the foods which are advertised, and there's very clear evidence on that pest to power is a direct result of marketing. There's very clear data to show that. And so what happens in supermarket settings and other settings, and I did indicate this about the school breakfast club, is that kids will then pester their parents, and what will happen is that the guilt that the parent feels, often a mum, often harried in all kinds of other ways, is so great. I can't give my child enough. I want to give my child more. So they're in a situation where they're much more likely, and to use this terrible expression, give in to their children as if it's a sign of weakness. It's a structural issue that they don't have the resources to provide what they really want to for their children. And so they're providing what they can, which is a very cheap chocolate bar or a packet of chips or something. So they are more vulnerable to manipulation by marketing, whereas somebody in my privileged position, I have the resources to the structural resources to say no, but this is a resource that I have that I can give to you as part as a mother to you. So it's even more insidious that not only is the targeting greater, but the vulnerability is greater. And that really is why addressing marketing is a fundamental part of addressing inequalities.
Good, thank you very much. Then, yeah, as a father of a 4-year-old, I can very much attest to that you get in situations where you give in. I would like to ask a quick follow-up question before we answer one more question. We have time for that, actually. But I didn't specifically get this out of your presentation. You mentioned a lot of these inequities and inequalities. But one thing, maybe it's an elephant in the room, I don't know, but from someone a little bit outside of the field, I didn't see that, education or these, I didn't see that specifically mentioned by you. Did you do that on purpose, or may I ask why?
Yeah, well, actually, I've just come out of a team meeting on this very question about what we call literacy, that encapsulates information, education, knowledge, skills. Because originally it was one of the pieces of the jigsaw, and it will be again a piece of the jigsaw. We're going to add, there are 3 things that are really missing there from what I showed you today, and it will be added because literacy sometimes is really not the main issue. So we often find in families that they know perfectly well what a healthy diet is, that the knowledge is not an issue, but there may be certain skills that are missing, there may not be, but there may be situations, particularly around, for example, care for young children, where education is incredibly important. A lot of every new parent is vulnerable and doesn't know what's going on, whatever income level you are, when it comes to feeding children, and things like education interventions, very, very important. Really consistent advice, good dietary counselling, very important. So yes, it is important. But one of the things about this jigsaw of realities is to say that all of these things are important, and what we mustn't do is to say education is the most important thing, or marketing is the most important thing, or financial insecurity is the most important thing. They may be the most important thing in certain contexts and not in others, but we need to consider all of these different realities in context. But you're absolutely right to mention that, and that will be in the final version of this, of what I've just shown today.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So in the interest of time, we'll table the other questions that have already appeared in the Q&A. So thank you once again for your presentation, and we look forward to poking a little bit more during the panel later. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Megan Blake, and there she is, her screen pops up. So she is a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Sheffield, and where she's also the department director of knowledge exchange and impact. And her work provides evidence-based support and knowledge to the UK's cost of living crisis. She's an advisor for many, or has many different advisor roles, including Feeding Britain, the VCSDP Hunger and Hardship Steering Group, Fair Share, and the Bread and Butter thing. And I believe she's going to talk a lot about food ladders today, which is an approach to building community resilience and enhancing food security. So again, without any further ado, Megan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to, my talk that I'm going to present today actually segues really well with Karina's. I'm going to add a little bit of dimension that she didn't talk about so much from a geographer's perspective, and really builds on about, this presentation really builds on about 15 years of research in and with communities. So my research methods include qualitative methods, but also some quantitative statistical analysis. I do a lot of hanging around and hanging out with people to try to understand what works for them, but how things, what they understand, but also how we can create solutions that are socially just, that enable people to live their very best lives. And it's in that context that I developed a framework. There's a landscape out there of support that is quite diverse, and some of it is super inspiring, but getting an understanding of it is kind of difficult at times. Distinguishing between what different kinds of interventions do or don't do can be a challenge for people. You can see the forest, but trying to understand how these different elements fit together is quite difficult. Sorry about the metaphor switching there. So without, I'm going to share my slides now and just go on from there. So there'll be a little bit, there we go, hopefully that will work. And there, yes, so hopefully you can all see those.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so So I'm going to really build on my food ladders, this framework that I developed to kind of give an insight, but also how we can build local foodscapes to enable people to be able to do that, to have the food they need, that helps to reward them, that meets all those kind of criteria that Karina mentioned. So my main point, or my main points that I want you to take away today are as follows. Food insecurity is not a static state. People come into or are vulnerable to it. Conditions change, their resources change, and they exit the degree or the level of food security that they have. So people fall into and exit food insecurity depending on their context, depending on the kind of resources that they've got available to them. Food insecurity or food security is more than economic. It has mental and physical health implications, as we've already discussed, not just physical health in the sense of dietary physical health or the diet-related poor health, but we also, for example, during this time, are hearing stories about people turning their refrigerators off and therefore disrupting the cold chain for the food within their refrigerator, which then leaves them vulnerable to those sort of things like Campylobacter and salmonella. We also hear people not cooking their food, so eating frozen pizza just raw, not eating it cooked because they can't afford or are unable, don't have access to a cooker, and so forth. We're also seeing increases in numbers of people who are eating out of date food, and I don't mean the best before dates. I mean the date by which you're beginning to be exposed to some of those little creepy crawlies that don't do well for you. So it's a food safety issue as well as a dietary issue. These things have implications and they settle into places and into people. So food insecurity is something that is multi-scalared, which means also the solutions are multi-scalared or need multiple scales of interaction, from the global, the national, the regional, all the way down to the scale of the body, or those geographies closest in. It also is geographical in the sense that it varies. Food insecurity or food security varies from place to place, depending on the collection of resources that help shape that place and give it the ability to enable people to access the food that they need. Vulnerability is increased or decreased depending on the local and individual resources people have available to them. And there is a whole range of structured solutions that are needed in order to repair the damage. So, we can look at food insecurity and think about single point solutions that will fix one thing, but they will address one aspect, but we need these sort of multiple kind of interventions that kind of think more systematically, because giving people, for example, more money will help with the financial aspect, but it doesn't repair those health issues, the losses of knowledge, the social connections that disappear when food disappears or becomes something that is part of a hostile environment for people. We also need to think very carefully, and Karina made a really good point about this, how activity is framed and assembled together, how the elements are brought together, makes an enormous difference to the impact that it can have. And so I'm going to kind of highlight these points in the rest of this talk. So there are lots of resources people need in order to be food secure, and we tend to focus on the financial resources that allow our market engagement with food. But there are also lots of other aspects that are required. We need knowledge, know-how, and know what. We need social resources such as reciprocity. So who can help you out when you've got other demands on your time? Are there things that do you know your neighbors? Can you share with them? If you need help, will they help you out? Can you share food together? And we really saw during the pandemic, people kind of these mutual aid societies and collective support, despite the fact that we were becoming more and more isolated and individualized in our house. We did see a kind of increase a moving forward of helping people be together, but that sort of seems to be disappearing now with this financial crisis. We also need time as a resource. So we need the time to be able to engage with the activity or set of interlinked activities that are required in order to get the food that we need. We need health, so we need headspace in order to make these and balance all the demands and decisions, and people who are struggling also, you know, that amount of headspace that they've got is impinged on by a whole bunch of other worries and stresses, which makes it difficult to kind of manage and coordinate all those things that they want to do, and Karina talked about that. And then we also need place-based resources. So we need physical infrastructures and materials where people can access them. It's not enough to have food somewhere further away, you need it in the place where you live. And one of the things we do see is that people who are struggling, neighborhoods, places where people are struggling or more likely to be struggling, are also places where those infrastructures tend to be degraded. So for example, you know, Karina talked an awful lot about how foodways and how know-how about food gets lost through pressures on households, but cumulatively in places where lots of folks are similarly experiencing this difficulty, and coupled with the profit motive within the food system, one of the things that we see is that then these healthy foods disappear from the landscape. So, and they become more expensive. So, you know, you can go into a supermarket or even a small shop in a wealthy area, and there will be a wide range of options. But if you go into a very poor area, the same retailer will have about, you know, about this much, about a foot's worth of vegetable selection in that supermarket, making it harder and more difficult and requiring people to go to multiple outlets in order to get the food that they need. So there's these kind of multiple resources come together within a framework that is structural as well. So there's legal, policy, and power relations that systematically disadvantage certain groups. So in order to have a socially just food security, these systematic disadvantages are also removed. So socially just food security enables all people in all places to have the food they need to live their best life, and does so without shame, stigma, and stress. The UN identifies 4 pillars of food security, and I usually like to show this slide because people tend to focus on the financial aspects, and that is definitely very important. And certainly we see in the United Kingdom in particular that, you know, people who don't have financial aspects are really struggling. But those other resources come to play in and against these other pillars that are identified. So access isn't just about affordability, it's also about legal and institutional type barriers. So for example, you may have money, but if the shop only accepts a bank card for payment, or vice versa, if you only have a bank card but you don't have cash, you can't access that food. There are social and cultural barriers that might also prevent access. For example, there may be food in the place where people live, but it's the wrong kind of food. We also need to think about the availability. Is there safe, healthy food in the place where I live that meets my physical and cultural needs? So it's not just about, can I access it, but is it here for me? And we hear stories of people who are unable to afford the bus, and, you know, because that comes out of their food budget. And so they're having to walk huge long distances to, you know, 2 or 3 miles to go get the food that they want, and then having to haul that back home. And of course, when you're doing that, you make decisions about what you can carry, which links again to notions of utilization. So utilization isn't just about food safety, and can my body utilize the food? Can I get the nutrients and things I need from the food that I'm eating? But it's also about things like, do I know how to cook it? Do I have the headspace? Am I motivated to eat well? So in the United Kingdom, one of the groups that's the least financially food insecure are people who are retired. Though this group of people, also older people, and particularly older people, are one of the groups that's incredibly vulnerable to food, to malnutrition, not because they can't afford the food, but because they don't have the motivation to eat because they're living on their own, for example. And so they snack or graze all day, or they just skip meals. All these things, of course, are intersecting with each other. And then There's an issue of the fourth pillar, of course, is the issue of stability. Can I do all these things all the time? So can I stand at the cooker all the time when I need to cook my food? Or can I unscrew the lid? Or do I have a physical aspect to me that makes it impossible for me to open that tin that I have? So all these things interconnect and intersect. This pillars is for the at household scale, but we can also think of different kinds of questions that operate at the national or regional scale. Like I said, there's lots of interventions out there aiming to segue in or to intervene, to intercept with these systems to rebuild people's assets or the resources that they have. But there's still a lot of evidence that needs to be collected. So there's very few rigorous intervention control trial type studies out there. And the ones that are there tend to be health focused. So there's some evidence that a basic food parcel model of free food, like tins, does not prevent food insecurity in the long term or even in the short term. There's evidence that people who use food banks, as we call them here in the UK, but that's a free food parcels, remain food insecure. So it doesn't solve their problem even immediately. We also see that diets suffer and as a result of the basic tinned food model, and they're often very stigmatizing. So in the United Kingdom, the Food EU2 data indicates that only of those people who have low or very low food security, so the people who would be likely to be eligible to use a food bank, only about 14% of people actually, of this group of people actually do use a food bank. So they're not socially acceptable particularly. Interestingly, the group that is most likely to use a food bank, of those who are very, very food insecure, are families with 3 or more children. And I suspect there's the weight of the urgency to feed your children outweighs that stigma associated with going and declaring to somebody that you have failed to do something that isn't very important to you. So there's a lot of failure around the food bank model, which isn't to say that food banks are bad or that we should get rid of all of them tomorrow, because people are hungry right now, but there are ways of tweaking how they're delivered that could make them a little bit more acceptable to people. There's some evidence that nutritional awareness alongside food options will improve health outcomes. And this is research on US Food Bank Plus models that give advice about healthy eating or shift the shelves around so that people select those things that are better for them. They found that if you put the vegetables by the door, people are more likely to take the vegetables than if they're at the back of the space. And there's some evidence that choice matters, but we're really not very clear about how much choice is enough. So is it just a case of explaining or making very clear what people's choices are, or is it about offering unlimited amounts of choice? And I suspect that's actually less, it's more toward making people aware of how they're making choices. There's some evidence from provider studies and these are from the organizations themselves, and there's a whole host of reasons why we don't have better evidence, but that pantries and social eating activities, a pantry is a kind of, you pay a small fee, it's like a food club. There's usually not a time limit. Quite often they're place-based. So anybody within a neighborhood can access these pantries. They tend to be located in highly deprived areas, but the stigma is reduced because all your neighbors can go and use these spaces. What the evidence suggests, and there have been some quite good studies with quite very large sample sizes that show that these sorts of activities increase the enjoyment of food, they improve well-being, they increase healthy eating and access to healthy foods, they increase community connections, so people report that they've made friends or they feel like they belong in their community now, and people indicate that they have less stigma than the free food parcel model. I already explained the socially acceptable element, and voucher studies have also indicated that, when you don't create barriers to participation and signal people out as being in poverty, but instead signal people out as belonging to a neighborhood. It makes an enormous difference to the acceptability of the intervention. There's evidence from cooking interventions that cookery skills help increase the ability to utilize food. Sorry, I just lost my spot. Increase the ability of people to utilize food, but also to expose them to what different foods are. It expands people's understanding of what is food. And you know, things that they never thought of as food become food. So things like parsnips or grapes. And then framing of the intervention makes an enormous difference. So but there is no evidence that there is one single magic bullet that will solve all the problems. Instead, it needs a much more systems intervention, multiple ways of addressing the problem. So given this sort of systems approach, I spent quite a lot of time with different kinds of activity, trying to understand and think through what are the contributions, what are the benefits of these different approaches, and develop this framework called the food ladders. So this food ladders approach is a local scale set of a way of thinking about what's happening on the ground at the local scale. This sits alongside national and regional level policy interventions. So it's not a replacement, it sits alongside. So in the UK, for example, we need a better welfare system, and I wouldn't deny that. But a better welfare system is not going to do that reparative work. We need these local interventions as well. There are 3 rungs on each ladder. It's a ladders, so there's multiple ladders, and there are 3 rungs on each ladders. Each ladder addresses a different domain. So this approach takes a practice theory-based understanding and looks at what is being done with different materials. So each ladder has 3 rungs. As I said, one is catching or crisis support, and this enables people to have the ability to cope. It does for people when they're at their tether. And this is important. You know, research on resilience argues that you do need that initial, place, a resting spot for people just to catch their breath. Rung 2 is capacity building. So one of the things, we can't expect people to go from emergency need and all the trauma that brings with it immediately to self-organizing and creating, agroecological principles and community gardens and all these sorts of things. You need this sort of capacity building in the middle, bearing in mind that, people still need support. They're still struggling. They haven't got all the capabilities to be able to fully engage that maybe people who aren't struggling would have. So capacity building is for people who are vulnerable to crisis, but they are not necessarily in crisis. These interventions enable adaptation through education and sharing. They tend to have lower stigma, and they provide more accessible food choices for people. So things that enable people to try new foods with low risk associated with them, for example. So the pantry model or the social eating activities are examples of that. So I mentioned before that there are different ladders, and the 4 ladders that I've really highlighted are food, social, economic, and health. There are probably other ladders. We could probably add in a ladder for environment. There might be other aspects, but these are the ones, because of the communities that I work with, these are the ones that I focused on. This isn't about organizations, it's about activity. So one of the things we find in the UK that there will be community-based efforts that are offering a free food parcel, but on a Thursday they might do an older people's social eating activity, and on a Tuesday they're doing something with children, and on Friday morning they may have a pantry scheme. So each one of those activities intersects with the ladders at different rungs, and different ladders in different ways. So just to think about that, and you can have some activity just because it's in rung 2 in the food domain, it might be rung 1 in the economic domain, and it might be rung 3 in the social domain, where people are organizing together to provide this support, for example. One of the keys, and because the focus, maybe I would say this because I'm a geographer, is that you can't just have a single rung in a place. You need to have multiple rungs in these places, and they're quite small scale places, so neighborhoods, within walking distance for people. And the key is to map these things, what's going on now, and then assemble across and build and fill in the gaps to repair those rungs that may be missing. And we are seeing a number of different local authorities developing food plans in the UK that are taking this approach and applying it in their local places to build up ladders of support in order to get people toward that transformative kind of action where people are doing by themselves or within their communities to kind of build up and create change. I am throwing the cash first question in here. I'm guessing I have about 3 minutes left. Is that correct? Yeah. This slide in, because one of the big movements that we're seeing in the UK at the minute is that we should be giving people cash and just get rid of food aid and go straight to cash first. And so it's becoming a real strong narrative. And so I've thought about it a lot. And, you know, cash may be better than going out and buying a bunch of tins. Certainly people who receive the cash say they're preferable to food banks. And remember, the food banks are the ones that, you know, they have a lot of stigma around them. They do increase people's spending power and a sense of autonomy compared to the food bank, where you're given a bag of goods that is, you know, a bunch of tins, and it may reach a larger number of people than the food bank does. But there are some other things that we need to consider when we think about these kinds of interventions, because they're a single point intervention. They don't do reparative work. They don't consider the other, you know, Cash First doesn't consider the other resource needs and effects that aren't addressed. You give people cash, they're just going to carry on buying the same things because they've got that scarcity mindset that food insecurity puts into people. I've talked to people who aren't food insecure anymore, and they still carry around with them the weight of that scarcity from a time when they were. It doesn't challenge structural inequalities that create social disadvantages, such as labor market disadvantage, access to education, different forms of discrimination. It doesn't address health and spatial inequalities. Cash is not a root cause solution. Instead, poverty is a symptom of social and spatial inequalities and power dynamics. Cash will help people in the short term, but it's not a systemic response. It doesn't redress food system failure because the money is then given to the producers of that failure. And there are issues around economies of scale. You know, is 10 quid really going to help people, or 10 euros really going to help people when actually 100,000 euros would help create a community hub that actually has all these other really important events. And Cash First is not preventative because of the focus on emergency need. It doesn't get people before they hit bottom. And one of the things we find is if we capture people before they sink to the very bottom, it's much easier to repair the damage that's done. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much. There's a few links and things to work that I've done or ways that I communicate, and I would welcome emails and the opportunity to talk with any of you more, should you wish that. So thank you, and I will try to stop sharing now.
Well, thank you very much, Megan. This fantastic presentation. Also, impressed by the few number of slides. Thank you very much. I actually would like to pick up right at your last slide about cash, because there was actually a question in our Q&A from Jasmina van Driel. Big thank you to your inspiring, enlightening presentation. You provide an overview of different resources needed to be food secure, financial, social, and so forth. However, in a financial, economic resource underpin many of their other resources, as you've understood. So, for example, you mentioned somewhere lack of headspace, which can be lowered by not only financial debt, but also stress. And then, so I think you've addressed this a little bit, but generally, could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on the general interactions between the different resources needed?
Sure. So they are interconnected, absolutely. And cash, we live in a capitalist market-based economy, and those other ways of being in the world that we have seen maybe in previous eras, where people would hunt, for example, or they glean, or they go, they shared space and had a commons that they farmed together. Those had other resources. We have moved to a system that is a very cash-based system. So that very cash-based system, or that market exchange, does create some of the problems as it solved some of the problems that we could have seen in some of those previous areas, such as weather and, you know, scarcity in times of abundance and times of scarcity. So that is a product of, it's a historical product of a way of doing, a way of practicing things. But I would also argue, and we saw this during the pandemic, and we spoke to people during the pandemic who were using food support, and it wasn't because they couldn't afford the food, because they could just about, but they would use food support to free up some of their money to do other things. So there was a woman that we spoke to who was getting free delivery parcels on a pay-as-you-feel basis. And she was so lonely. She was so lonely that she opted to do that so that she could buy an expensive television subscription to enable her to feel connected to other people. So that social, if she'd had the social resources, she had the ability to connect with people. If she had social, you know, one of the things about neoliberalism is it isolates and individualizes us. When you have problems that you share together, there's problems divided, right? So that's another, that's one example. And the example of older people that I'd mentioned before, they're very vulnerable to malnutrition. And some of that is physical, so being able to walk to the shops or be able to unscrew the lid, or that just the motivation to be able to go and, you know, cook for yourself. So many people talk about not knowing anybody, their friends have died, or they haven't maintained those friendship networks, and then they stop eating properly. When we have talked to people who actually have strong friendship networks where they eat together, or have ways of interacting together, the focus on the poor health seems to disintegrate or go away, but also they eat better. So there are these, the resources, if we can think of them not as one on top of the other, but as a Venn diagram that overlaps, things are independent but connected at the same time. That would be my explanation. That would be my elaboration of that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I think, yeah, we'll have more time for questions as we move on to the panel discussion now. So if you have any questions from the audience, please type them in, and we'll go through them and try to address them. So at this point, I would like to first of all introduce our last or our other panelist, who is Dr. Hugo de Vries. There he is, wonderful. He has a PhD in physics, which I found important to note, and he's currently the research director at INRAE in France, where he's a member of INRAE's scientific directory team on food, nutrition, and bioeconomy. He's also president of the European Federation of Food Science and Technology, and a coordinator of the European project Food Path, which JPI HDHL was also involved with. And he is also an associate international member of the French Academy of Agriculture. Yes, I would like I said, very happy that Hugo was able to join us for the panel. And also actually, Corinna is back on, has her camera on, she can join us as well. So I'd first like to kind of hand over the microphone to Hugo. Maybe he can briefly add some commentary to what we've heard so far from your perspective.
Now, that is, of course, a pleasure. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much, Karsten, for your kind introduction and also for sharing the session, and to Corinna and Megan for the two wonderful presentations. I'm so happy to see in the presentations also that you are very action oriented, try to find solutions, try to understand what's really taking place in the fields, and to see what really works and what does not work. Maybe you see on the back, you see written food passes. That is a European project. It started in June last year, so it's relatively recent, and it has the ambition to develop the prototype partnership sustainable food systems. So this is one of the 49 large partnerships initiated by the Commission on the Horizon Europe program, and in all domains. So there are 6 in the area of agri-food and nutrition, and there are others in transport and medicine and so on. One which is really focusing on sustainable food systems, that is this partnership, Sustainable Food Systems, and we are trying to develop its building blocks. And what we work on is on an agenda where I see back many of the issues that you have mentioned. So luckily we are aligned, otherwise we should have redone our work. I think also Megan, with your colleague, Professor Jackson, leading the group of SAPEA-SAM for sustainable food systems, I presume that there are a lot of exchanges and we have learned from them issues that we have included. And why do the topics that you have mentioned come back so wonderfully? In fact, what is the ambition? The ambition is that we hope to contribute to the sustainable food systems of tomorrow in 2050 at the latest, but hopefully well before. So whatever we propose in our food systems, it should not compromise our future generations, multiple ones. So that means that whatever measure we are going to take in European food systems, that is our focus. But of course, we need to be very careful with trade-offs somewhere else in the world, that it should not have any negative consequences somewhere else. That's very easy to say, extremely difficult, of course, to realize. But we focus on already sustainable food systems in Europe. Will we reach that or not? And in that, we have defined 4 focus areas from a research and innovation point of view. And there are 2 that are directly linked to the 2 presentations before. The first is on change the way we eat, or change the way what we eat. So it is a lot on the diets, but also on the diets where they are consumed and by who they are consumed, not by an individual one, but also by communities. And the second is the food environment. What is the role of the food environment? Because it's there where we can see what works, but it's also there what we can learn from our citizens, what we need to do and what we certainly should forget. So those are 2 of the key areas, and I'm happy that you underlined key issues in that. There are 2 others to complement. The third area is change the way we provide food, with a focus on processing and distribution. The reason is that we focus a little bit more on post-farming and post-fishing, is that the other partnership tackle issues in production in the blue or in the green environment. There is one, for example, on agroecology, there is one on the blue economy. And we focus a little bit more on post farming. So how to provide food in such a way via processes and logistic schemes and maybe home preparation methods that finally are helping our transition towards sustainable food systems. And the 4th topic, you addressed it slightly, but I think it's also a very important topic, that is change the way we govern food systems at all levels, from local to global, in purely the public domain, but also in public-private domain. We may think about code of conduct principles and so on, where we definitely include all the variety of actors. And in those list of actors, there are then communities. We have the ECLIs or the Milan Food Pacts, that's at the community level. We have at the regional level interventions. There is a groupment in Europe which is called ERIAF. We have at the national and global levels, but also the philanthropic organizations. They are very well organized and they have an enormous support to activities in our domain, and also at the farmer and industry side, from the startups, small enterprises to the larger ones. They, in one way, they should be involved in the new measures to take, and their creativity should be brought up to help to this transition. So your presentation fits very well in what the initiative is at the European level towards the Partnership Sustainable Food Systems. Here I stop because maybe there are other kind of questions and I don't want to take all the time.
Thank you, Hugo. This was great, and I'm really glad that we have a lot of agreement. Although I sometimes think we need to have a little bit of disagreement to make progress. And so I would actually like to touch on something that we have, I think, heard from all three of you in some ways, and I'm naive in asking this question, but I really want to hear all three of your thoughts. And part one of the question is, why are these what we consider unhealthy foods? Why are they more affordable, easier to access, more economic, so to say? And really, what do you think needs to be done to flip this relationship? You've mentioned all of this, and I think we all know, but this is kind of, is it really, what are the predominant factors that play a role that we have? So I was thinking, we live in a world where everything is, I can have everything on my doorstep within 24 or 48 hours. And all of a sudden we live in, we have these food deserts. So I'm trying to wrap my head around it. The one side, we can access anything from anywhere on the globe, and on the other side, we have problems of getting something somewhere. So what do you think is the biggest issue to tackle here? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in here. So in terms of what the situation is, I think it's really important to be clear that when it comes to the price of food, the cost of food, there are nutritious foods which are affordable to low-income families. The challenge is that they don't meet the criteria of the other aspects of their lives, which Megan and I seem to read each other's minds in the way that we were articulating it, just in quite different ways. And so, for example, you can get beans, legumes at very low prices, but you don't have the resources, to use Megan's term, to prepare those, whether it's the headspace resources or whether it's the household assets you've got at home. So, and there are other foods which meet the cultural preferences of families, which are really outside of their affordability range. And I say, things that kids like and that are acceptable to those families. So we mustn't make the mistake of thinking it's just about the price of food. It's the price of food in context. That's really, really important. And it can lead to some warped policy discussions, and we need to be really clear about that. You also mentioned about geographic access, about this kind of, there's food everywhere. And yet there's people that live in food deserts. And I made the point in when I was talking about access that convenient, long shelf life, palatable foods are actually generally geographically accessible. That doesn't mean that they are not difficult to access by certain groups who don't have certain resources available to them in order to access them. But even people who live in food deserts, if they have the resources, can tend to access those foods. So again, there's perhaps been a little bit too much emphasis on it just being about access. So it's not just about price, it's not just about access, but they can be very, very important in certain contexts with certain people. So you asked about why. So the question that I have is, why is it that the foods which are easy to prepare with the resources that these families have and which are affordable, why is it that they tend to be less healthy? And the reason for that is to do with complex, actually not so complex, if you look at it, factors in the food system, about obtaining cheap ingredients from staples and oil seeds and converting them into ingredients that are used in processed foods or very starchy foods like pasta. And the situation is that the ingredients are very cheap. There's economies of scale in processing, and companies can add value to those foods. And so even if the margin is low, if there's enough volume going out the door, you can still make money out of them. So it's an economic issue to do with the cost of ingredients and processing. That means that long shelf life and palatability are cheap.
Well, thank you. Anyone? Megan, yes.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's just been said. One of the things, just the shelf life thing is really important. So I was speaking to a guy who runs a magazine for corner shops. and that's, you know, the readership, it's kind of a professional magazine. And he was telling me that, you know, one of the problems with running a corner shop or a small fruit and veg vendor, say here in the United Kingdom, is that, you know, the food that is in a fruit and veg vendor goes off really, really quickly. And so there's a lot more waste and financial loss associated with selling fruits and veg as opposed to frozen food or food that's tinned, which can last on a shelf for a very, very long time. So there's more risk associated with selling fruits and vegetables, but also there are structures around taxation that make it less profitable to offer these sort of healthier outlets. In the UK context, I'm not clear on what the context is in other parts of Europe, but in the UK context, the council tax rates, for example, are the same whether you run a fish and chip shop, which can make lots of money, and, you know, not that fish and chips isn't lovely and we don't, you know, they're nice, and we could argue that there are elements of fish and chips which are very good for you, but the council tax is the same as that fruit and veg vendor, and you have to sell a whole lot more fruits and veg in order to cover those costs, like with the electricity and all these other things. So the costs associated with selling some of these better foods push up the price for them, and pushing them beyond the affordability for many people. And of course, if you can't afford them, you're gonna, you know, you've got a choice between 5 frozen pizzas, which you can carry home super easily on the bus, and they stick, and they're the same on Friday as they are on Monday, and everybody likes pizza, and there's no, you know, there's no worry about that, as opposed to a bag of apples and onions, and, you know, they get mashed up on the way home. So that there's a whole issue around what is risky for both the retailer, but also what is risky for the household.
Thank you. Hugo, yes.
Yeah, I also agree with the 2 previous speakers. The question is much more difficult to answer than just to say, I think that the prices are higher for the healthy foods. But as Corina also said, the economies of scale principle is so strong, and it has been over decennia that is being adopted by the trade. And there's also how to compete with it. That's the main question. But there is also something very particular in it, because, and it was also the big ones who told me, the big industries, they say the value in diversity is much higher than the value in just single or monocultures. If we look to our resources, there are so many ingredients in it with such a high value, not only for the food industry, but also in others. That's a question of organization. And the fact that we as big companies have organized and streamlined everything makes us so efficient and dominating that the others cannot win. But if the others are capable of developing new kind of business models where there are multiple enterprises targeting multiple markets, it could be that they win, that we will lose finally as the big companies, because the value of diversity is higher than the value of. I don't know if this is really true. We did some research on it, on circular business models with multiple stakeholders. There is certainly something that is extremely interesting to further look at. So this is more in the area of organizational innovations, but then linked to new kind of technological innovations that are more efficient at small scale than at high scale. And those technologies exist. And also with social innovations, as underlined by Corina and Megan, because it is definitely also the direct food environment who is going to play a dominant role if those are accepted, those more smaller scale, local organizational innovations, yes or no. So it remains for me also a very big question. Can it become a dominant stream, yes or no? And can it compete finally with the economies of scale? I don't have a direct answer, but I think there are some very triggering issues in this also from a scientific perspective. The biodiversity people always say, if we are losing our diversity, our system finally collapses. And that, I think, also holds for our economics systems. So it is not just a few big ones, because finally they also can fall down.
I actually would like to pick up on that, because I think it's something that I think we've noticed, that this lack of diversity actually can also make our systems quite vulnerable. And I remember I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and I remember walking during COVID, walking into the store, and we didn't have flour. We all know about the toilet paper, but I was also thinking about flour. There was no yeast around, so I couldn't bake, for example. And so I was actually wondering if, taking this as an example, now we've gone through various crises, but I would suggest that at least in terms of COVID, we are at the end of this crisis. So when we look back, what can we learn from a crisis, and specifically in this case from the COVID crisis with regards specifically to food insecurity? So kind of thinking about glass half full. What do we take away so we don't make some of the same mistakes in the future?
I would say that the big learning is that inequality costs. I tried to set out in my talk that, albeit very briefly, that inequality is at the core of the reduced resilience and the inadequate resilience in the food system. There are some parts of the food system which are actually remarkably resilient through COVID in many parts of the world, not everywhere, but there was some that were. But that if we continue on a fundamentally inequitable economic model, that this crisis is just going to continue. I mean, many critiques of our model are just accept that it is a model through which crisis is an inherent part of the model. So I think we can learn that crisis is an inherent part of the model as long as it stays as it is. And that some fundamental shifts will need to happen if we are to reduce the likelihood of crises. And when it comes to actually how to address crises, I think it just reinforces what we've been trying to communicate today, which is that the process of change for families in situations of severe constraint is not a simple fact of just reducing prices or providing more cash or whatever. That might be the case if they were starting from zero, but you're starting from a situation of now. The process of change will take a quite intensive, comprehensive effort of changing all of these different elements of what I was calling realities, and Megan was referring to as resources. And if you're really going to address it, then that's what you need to do. And there's no two ways about it. You just have to do it.
Sorry, can I go? Do you want to go? You go, would you? Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that completely. One of the things also is about how we organize. So I mean this by political organization, so it's linked to the economy, but also about what we prioritize, what we benefit or give benefit to in our policies. So certainly there are policy redressing that can go on. Also during the crisis, during the pandemic, we did a piece of work. I did a piece of work, John Lever at Huddersfield, and we did this research around the networks that were forming, and not just the food crisis support, but also looking at what farmers were going to do as they were losing the people who were picking their crops for them, because we had Brexit during that time as well. So one of the things that we discovered, we were looking at how people were coping in this time period, and one of the things that we saw is during the crisis, when the region took on a much more networked set of interactions, where people were sharing across boundaries. So they weren't just connecting with other organizations like themselves, but the small shops were connecting up with the food support organizations, and the taxi firms were connecting with the small producers who had been restaurant retail and how they pivoted and changed, but connected with different kinds of actors within that landscape. It formed a net for people, as opposed to a hierarchical structure, top-down, single silos kind of working, which caused some of that rigidity, and that efficiency also caused some of the scarcity that we saw during that time period. So different flexible, sorry, I might be getting too theoretical here, but different flexible forms of connection also, and the way of that organizing is also one of the lessons that we saw, you know, from local scale neighbors interacting with each other to these sort of larger small scale food system collaborations that occurred. So I would just add that.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting, if you allow me, Karsten, to
Please, yeah.
To follow up on that. I think Prigozhin already in the 80s won a Nobel Prize for it, and showed us that if diversity is passing a lower limit, then something can freeze and become really rigid and never moves again. But if it passes an upper limit, it can end up in chaos, and also that could not be a favorable situation. It's somewhere in between that we need to find our solution. So we cannot, if we don't have a certain level of diversity in our food systems and something happens, so if we all go to one monoculture and one thing happens, the full system may collapse. So that is not an option. If we go to too many nodes in our network that we like to be connected with all, then it easily can become a chaos. And there's somewhere in between that we need to find our solution. Some people said, now with the situation in Ukraine, we need to become autonomous. That is also not the option, because it also means that what happens in the developing countries that could be directly blocked and have devastating effects there. So we need to keep connected, but we have to think, how can we get a number of diverse food systems that if something happened, we can switch to several alternatives, and how can we connect it to the rest of the world in fair exchange mechanisms that they will not suffer for the choices that we make if we move to another food system. I think those are the two critical issues. Luckily, we have in Europe a diversity and a rich diversity of different food systems, but we were not relying on them, or they were completely disconnected at the moment that the crisis starts. So maybe we should also better connect between them. That's good for our cultural food heritage as well.
Thank you. I want to, in the interest of time, keep it brief, but I have one question for Corinna and maybe Megan too, because you were speaking about framing. And I was thinking, you know, with one thing that I've learned in the last few crises that we've lived through is that, yeah, there's some form of polarization in our society, that, you know, even though we accept the crisis and it's present, that having a solution maybe, or having an approach to this crisis may result in people actually really being on the other side, and kind of being perceived as you know, I don't know, interfering with on many different levels. So one example, this was coming up in a question that was earlier. If you think about, you know, plant-based meals, for example, in school meals or something, how do you frame that without maybe, yeah, I don't know, getting, yeah, and not insulting, but at least, you know, kind of entering then into kind of a question about, you know, veganism, vegetarianism, and etc. With that kind of to keep it out of this polarized context. Is that something you've encountered in your work? One of you, Corinna, you're
in the interest of time, I'll just be very brief. But I think the inclusion of sustainability concerns is obviously really important from a broader food systems perspective, and I think it's really to reflect on the meanings that that shift has for people. So for some who self-identify very strongly and for whom talking about veganism is part of their identity, and in fact may convey a certain sense of moral superiority in conveying that. And for others, meat is associated with masculinity and status, and actually for people on low incomes, that actually is very important to them. So it comes back to really understanding, and one of the things in the jigsaw I put was this point about meanings and identity around food, that needs to be considered in making this change, rather than saying it's a kind of toxic, well, it is a toxic environment, it's kind of black or it's white. It's to say, let's really understand where people are coming from this issue, and let's see how we can move, because it's clearly important to reduce meat intake in a place like Europe, which is consuming very high levels on average. But let's see how we can meet people where they are and move and accept that that is fine, rather than these stupid people who don't understand. So that is what I think is really needed in order to bring people with us on that journey.
Okay, well, thank you. To wrap things up, like I said, we're already over time, but I think this has been a fantastic discussion so far. I do want to ask a question from John Mathers, who happens to be president of our SAB right now, so I can't pass on his question, of course. But I think it's also a really important question. I want to turn this back into something for you to kind of make it clear. So we've talked a lot about policy development, implementation, but do you have like 1 or 2 questions for further research that are really needed, maybe even to the basic research? What things need to happen in terms of research to further underpin these new policies? So I don't know, maybe Megan, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm sure, well, all right, I'm going to answer this with what am I interested in pursuing, as opposed to what must be pursued. So for me, there's 2 areas. Firstly, I feel like I've kind of figured out, or am in the space of figuring out what the difference between rung and rung 2 is, but I'm really interested in that transformative space. And how do we move communities that have been done to for so long that they have lost, or they feel like they need permission to innovate themselves? How do we move into that, and what does it look like? How can we create transformation? So that's one thing that I'm super interested in, is actually how do we make that happen? And the second thing, the second area is actually there needs to be a lot more systematic control type trials of the interventions that we're trying. So some sort of experimentation, but then also seeing in what ways and what are the broad range of impacts that are potential out there, moving beyond just the nutritional, for example, but are there social impacts? Are there economic impacts? What are the wider impacts of these different kinds of interventions? And can we demonstrate them? Just to get a sense of, what is the value for doing these things? So that would be
perfect. Thank you. Hugo, you'll go next. I'm sure you have many research questions in mind. So pick one.
Yeah, maybe the best. I'm not an expert in this area of research, and so the first remark is please check the SRIA, the Strategic Research Agenda of the Partnership Sustainable Food Systems. One of the 4 areas is exactly focused on this. But if I've well understood, Gianluca Brunori is professor in Pisa. One of the key questions is also, what are the consequences of policies at different scales? What are barriers in between them? And both if you look to the public sector on itself, but also at the interface of public-private sectors, and what are hindering factors and what not. So that is what I've learned, because something could be very efficient and with very positive outcomes at a very local scale, but then doesn't work out at other skills. So that's what I've learned from him, but I'm not an expert, so I excuse myself for a short answer like this.
Thank you very much. Brenna, your last research.
So I think there's a couple of things, and one of them is around this: can co-creation of policy and intervention responses be workable. So this relates again to the point that's just been made about engaging with communities who have learned to be subservient and in fact could take a lot of agency in this. Is that possible? Are there methods that can work to do that? And secondly, when it comes from a food systems perspective, is to understand about how the actions that are taken to address this, what repercussions do they have in other parts of food systems on sustainability, on livelihoods, and the reverberations across the food system, to try and get a larger group of people together who are working on different food systems issues to address this, understanding it's not only a food systems issue, it's also an economic system issue and other systems that play a role. And then there, thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, I would like to thank both Corinna and Megan for their presentations. Hugo, also thank you again for joining the panel. I really enjoyed the discussion. I've learned a lot today. And just to briefly summarize, I think I've learned, or we've all learned, that food insecurity is a consequence of many different inequities, but also that it's not a static thing, but actually people enter and may also be able to exit this state. So thinking in a more positive way, I think, because of its complexity and the lack, or the fact that it is not static, I think lots of things can be done. I don't think we found the single bullet that will solve this, but again, I think it is very encouraging that things can move forward. So with that, again, thanks also to the audience who stayed along for a little bit. Thank you for listening, and I would like to hand over the microphone very briefly back to Jessica.
Thank you, Carsten. I will keep it very brief because I'm aware that we've gone a little bit over the time, but I always think it's a good sign when everybody hangs around until the end because they're interested, of course. So thank you, Carsten, for wonderful moderation. Hugo, Corinna, and Megan, thank you very much for your insightful presentations. It's great to have you as part of the JPI HDHL network. And maybe just as a reminder, we will be sending out recordings and copies of the presentations in PDF format for everybody who has signed up for this webinar. And last but not least, in case you haven't seen yet my comment in the chat, just making you all aware of JPI HDHL's pre-announcement of a new call that will be launched at the end of February, which is quite fitting, which was not planned, but fits very well actually within this discussion as well. And the topic is new food resources and technologies to improve public health and food security. So please take a look at our website that will be launched at the end of the month. Again, thank you all for your attention, for your presence, for your insightful discussions and thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you.